Welcome to this compilation of 4 short stories by Roger Dee. I'll be narrating The Anglers of Arz, Unwelcome Tenant, Clean Break, and The Frogs of Mars. If you enjoy these stories, make sure to check out the many others as standalones and compilations on this channel. And if they aren't enough, there are more on my Substack, both freely available and some paid exclusive novelettes. There are a few Roger Dee stories over there too. Link to that in the description. But for now, let's get to the stories, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. The Anglers of Arz by Roger Dee. Narrated by William Skye. In order to make Isaac Walton's sport complete, there must be an angler, a fish, and some bait. All 3 existed on Arz, but there was a question as to which was which. The 3rd night of the Marco 4's landfall on the moonless Altarian planet was a repetition of the 2 before it, a 9-hour intermission of drowsy pastoral peace. Navigator Arthur Farrell, it was his turn to stand watch, was sitting at an open side port with a magnoscanner ready, but in spite of his vigilance he had not exposed a film when the inevitable pre-dawn rainbow began to shimmer over the eastern ocean. Sunrise brought him alert with a jerk, frowning at sight of 2 pinkish bipedal Arzian fishermen posted on the tiny coral islet a quarter-mile offshore, their blank triangular faces turned stolidly toward the beach. "They're at it again," Farrell called and dropped to the mossy turf outside. "Roll out on the double. I'm going to magnafilm this." Stryker and Gibson came out of their sleeping cubicles reluctantly, belting on the loose shorts which all 3 wore in the balmy Arzian climate. Stryker blinked and yawned as he let himself through the port, his fringe of white hair tousled and his naked paunch sweating. He looked, Farrell thought for the 1000th time, more like a retired cook than like the veteran commander of a Terran colonies expedition. Gibson followed, stretching his powerfully muscled body like a wrestler to throw off the effects of sleep. Gibson was linguist-ethnologist of the crew, a blocky man in his early 30s with thick black hair and heavy eyebrows that shaded a square, humorless face. "Any sign of the squids yet?" he asked. "They won't show up until the dragons come," Farrell said. He adjusted the light filter of the magnoscanner and scowled at Stryker. "Lee, I wish you'd let me break up the show this time with a disbeam. This butchery gets on my nerves." Stryker shielded his eyes with his hands against the glare of sun on water. "You know I can't do that, Arthur. These Arzians may turn out to be 5th-order beings or higher, and under Terran regulations our tampering with what may be a basic culture pattern would amount to armed invasion. We'll have to crack that cackle and grunt language of theirs and learn something of their mores before we can interfere." Farrell turned an irritable stare on the incurious group of Arzians gathering nets and fishing spears in hand at the edge of the sheltering bramble forest. "What stumps me is their motivation," he said. "Why do the fools go out to that islet every night when they must know damned well what will happen next morning?" Gibson answered him with an older problem, his square face puzzled. "For that matter, what became of the city I saw when we came in through the stratosphere? It must be a tremendous thing, yet we've searched the entire globe in the Scouter and found nothing but water and a scattering of little islands like this one, all covered with bramble. It wasn't a city these pink fishers could have built either. The architecture was beyond them by 1,000,000 years." Stryker and Farrell traded baffled looks. The city had become something of a fixation with Gibson, and his dogged insistence, coupled with an irritating habit of being right, had worn their patience thin. "There never was a city here, Gib," Stryker said. "You dozed off while we were making planetfall, that's all." Gibson stiffened resentfully, but Farrell's voice cut his protest short. Get set! Here they come! Out of the morning rainbow dropped a swarm of winged lizards, 20 feet in length and a glistening chlorophyll green in the early light. They stooped like hawks upon the islet offshore, burying the two Arzian fishes instantly under their snapping, threshing bodies. Then, around the outcrop, the sea boiled whitely, churned to foam by a sudden uprushing of black octopoid shapes. "The squids," Stryker grunted. "Right on schedule. 2 seconds too late, as usual, to stop the slaughter." A barrage of barbed tentacles lashed out of the foam and drove into the melee of winged lizards. The lizards took the air at once, leaving behind 3 of their number who disappeared under the surface like harpooned seals. No trace remained of the 2 Arzian natives. "A neat example of dog-eat-dog," Farrell said, snapping off the magnoscanner. "Do any of those beauties look like city builders, Gib?" Chattering pink natives straggled past from the shelter of the thorn forest, ignoring the Earthmen, and lined the casting ledges along the beach to begin their day's fishing. "Nothing we've seen yet could have built that city," Gibson said stubbornly. "But it's here somewhere and I'm going to find it. Will either of you be using the scouter today?" Stryker threw up his hands. "I've a mountain of data to collate, and Arthur is off duty after standing watch last night. Help yourself, but you won't find anything." The scouter was a speeding dot on the horizon when Farrell crawled into his sleeping cubicle a short time later, leaving Stryker to mutter over his litter of notes. Sleep did not come to him at once. A vague sense of something overlooked prodded irritatingly at the back of his consciousness, but it was not until drowsiness had finally overtaken him that the discrepancy assumed definite form. He recalled then that on the first day of the Marco's planetfall, one of the pink fishes had fallen from a casting ledge into the water and had all but drowned before his fellows pulled him out with extended spear shafts. Which meant that the fishes could not swim, else some would surely have gone in after him. And the Marco's crew had explored Arz exhaustively without finding any slightest trace of boats or of boat landings. The train of association completed itself with automatic logic, almost rousing Farrell out of his doze. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "No boats, and they don't swim. Then how the devil do they get out to that islet?" He fell asleep with the paradox unresolved. Stryker was still humped over his records when Farrell came out of his cubicle and broke a packaged meal from the food locker. The Visicom over the control board hummed softly, its screen blank on open channel. "Gibson found his lost city yet?" Farrell asked, and grinned when Stryker snorted. "He's scouring the daylight side now," Stryker said. "Arthur, I'm going to ground Gib tomorrow, much as I dislike giving him a direct order. He's got that phantom city on the brain, and he lacks the imagination to understand how dangerous to our assignment an obsession of that sort can be." Farrell shrugged. "I'd agree with you offhand if it weren't for Gib's bull-headed habit of being right. I hope he finds it soon, if it's here. I'll probably be standing his watch until he's satisfied." Stryker looked relieved. "Would you mind taking it tonight? I'm completely bushed after today's logging." Farrell waved a hand and took up his magnoscanner. It was dark outside already, the close, soft night of a moonless tropical world whose moist atmosphere absorbed even starlight. He dragged a chair to the open port and packed his pipe, settling himself comfortably while Stryker mixed a nightcap before turning in. Later he remembered that Stryker dissolved a tablet in his glass, but at the moment it meant nothing. In a matter of minutes the older man's snoring drifted to him, a sound faintly irritating against the velvety hush outside. Farrell lit his pipe and turned to the inconsistencies he had uncovered. The Arzians did not swim, and without boats. It occurred to him then that there had been 2 of the pink fishes on the islet each morning, and the coincidence made him sit up suddenly, startled. Why 2? Why not 3 or 4 or only 1? He stepped out through the open lock and paced restlessly up and down on the springy turf, feeling the ocean breeze soft on his face. 3 days of dull, routine log work had built up a need for physical action that chafed his temper. He was intrigued and at the same time annoyed by the enigmatic relation that linked the Arzian fishes to the dragons and squids, and his desire to understand that relation was aggravated by the knowledge that Arz could be a perfect world for Terran colonization. That is, he thought wryly, if Terran colonists could stomach the weird custom pursued by its natives of committing suicide in pairs. He went over again the improbable drama of the past 3 mornings, and found it not too unnatural until he came to the motivation and the means of transportation that placed the Arzians in pairs on the islet, when his whole fabric of speculation fell into a tangled snarl of inconsistencies. He gave it up finally. How could any Earthman rationalize the outlandish compulsions that actuated so alien a race? He went inside again, and the sound of Stryker's muffled snoring fanned his restlessness. He made his decision abruptly, laying aside the magnoscanner for a hand flash and a pocket-sized Audicom unit, which he clipped to the belt of his shorts. He did not choose a weapon because he saw no need for one. The torch would show him how the natives reached the outcrop, and if he should need help, the Audicom would summon Stryker. Investigating without Stryker's sanction was, strictly speaking, a breach of Terran regulations, but... "Damn Terran regulations," he muttered. "I've got to know." Farrell snapped on the torch at the edge of the thorn forest and entered briskly, eager for action now that he had begun. Just inside the edge of the bramble, he came upon a pair of Arzians curled up together on the mossy ground, sleeping soundly, their triangular faces wholly blank and unrevealing. He worked deeper into the underbrush and found other sleeping couples, but nothing else. There were no humming insects, no twittering night birds or scurrying rodents. He had worked his way close to the center of the island without further discovery, and was on the point of turning back, disgusted, when something bulky and powerful seized him from behind. A sharp sting burned his shoulder, wasp-like, and a sudden overwhelming lassitude swept him into a darkness deeper than the Arzian night. His last conscious thought was not of his own danger, but of Stryker, asleep and unprotected behind the Marco's open port. He was standing erect when he woke, his back to the open sea and a prismatic glimmer of early dawn rainbow shining on the water before him. For a moment he was totally disoriented. Then from the corner of an eye he caught the pinkish blur of an Arzian fisher standing beside him, and cried out hoarsely in sudden panic when he tried to turn his head, and could not. He was on the coral outcropping offshore, and except for the involuntary muscles of balance and respiration, his body was paralyzed. The first red glow of sunrise blurred the reflected rainbow at his feet, but for some seconds his shuttling mind was too busy to consider the danger of predicament. "Whatever brought me here anesthetized me first," he thought. "That sting in my shoulder was like a hypo needle." Panic seized him again when he remembered the green flying lizards. More seconds passed before he gained control of himself, sweating with the effort. He had to get help. If he could switch on the Audicom at his belt and call Stryker... He bent every ounce of his will toward raising his right hand, and failed. His arm was like a limb of lead, its inertia too great to budge. He relaxed the effort with a groan, sweating again when he saw a fiery half-disk of sun on the water, edges blurred and distorted by tiny surface ripples. On shore he could see the Marco IV resting between thorn forest and beach, its silvered sides glistening with dew. The port was still open, and the empty carrier rack in the bow told him that Gibson had not yet returned with the scouter. He grew aware then that sensation was returning to him slowly, that the cold surface of the Audicom unit at his hip, unfelt before, was pressing against the inner curve of his elbow. He bent his will again toward motion, This time the arm tensed a little, enough to send hope flaring through him. If he could put pressure enough against the stud... The tiny click of its engaging sent him faint with relief. "Striker!" he yelled. "Lee, roll out! Striker!" The Audicom hummed gently without answer. He gathered himself for another shout, and recalled with a chill of horror the tablets Striker had mixed into his nightcap the night before. Worn out by his work, Striker had made certain that he would not be easily disturbed. The flattened sun disk on the water brightened and grew rounder. Above its reflected glare he caught a flicker of movement, a restless suggestion of flapping wings. He tried again. "Striker, help me! I'm on the islet!" The Audicom crackled. The voice that answered was not Striker's but Gibson's. "Farrell, what the devil are you doing on that butcher's block?" Farrell fought down an insane desire to laugh. "Never mind that! Get here fast, Gib! The flying lizards!" He broke off, seeing for the first time the octopods that ringed the outcrop just under the surface of the water, waiting with barbed tentacles spread and yellow eyes studying him glassily. He heard the unmistakable flapping of wings behind and above him then, and thought with shock-born lucidity, "I wanted a backstage look at this show, and now I'm one of the cast." The scouter roared in from the west across the thorn forest, flashing so close above his head that he felt the wind of its passage. Almost instantly he heard the shrilling blast of its emergency bow jets as Gibson met the lizard swarm head-on. Gibson's voice came tinnily from the Audicom. "Scattered them for the moment, Arthur. Blinded the whole crew with the exhaust, I think. Stand fast now. I'm going to pick you up." The scouter settled on the outcrop beside Farrell, so close that the hot wash of its exhaust gases scorched his bare legs. Gibson put out thick brown arms and hauled him inside like a straw man, ignoring the native. The scouter darted for shore with Farrell lying across Gibson's knees in the cockpit, his head hanging half overside. Farrell had a last dizzy glimpse of the islet against the rush of green water below, and felt his shaky laugh of relief stick in his throat. Two of the octopods were swimming strongly for shore, holding the rigid Arzian native carefully above water between them. "Gib," Farrell croaked. "Gib, can you risk a look back? I think I've gone mad." The scouter swerved briefly as Gibson looked back. "You're all right, Arthur. Just hang on tight. I'll explain everything when we get you safe in the Marco." Farrell forced himself to relax, more relieved than alarmed by the painful pricking of returning sensation. "I might have known it, damn you," he said. "You found your lost city, didn't you?" Gibson sounded a little disgusted, as if he were still angry with himself over some private stupidity. "I'd have found it sooner if I'd had any brains. It was underwater, of course." In the Marco 4, Gibson routed Striker out of his cubicle and mixed drinks around, leaving Farrell comfortably relaxed in the padded control chair. The paralysis was still wearing off slowly, easing Farrell's fear of being permanently disabled. "We never saw the city from the scouter because we didn't go high enough," Gibson said. "I realized that finally, remembering how they used high-altitude blimps during the first wars to spot submarines. And when I took the scouter up far enough, there it was, at the ocean bottom, a city to compare with anything men ever built." Striker stared. "A marine city? What use would sea creatures have for buildings?" "None," Gibson said. "I think the city must have been built ages ago, by men or by a man-like race judging from the architecture, and was submerged later by a sinking of land masses that killed off the original builders and left Arz nothing but an oversized archipelago. The squids took over then, and from all appearances they've developed a culture of their own." "I don't see it," Striker complained, shaking his head. "The pink fishers are cattle or less," Gibson finished. The octopods are the dominant race, and they're so far above Fifth Order that we're completely out of bounds here. Under Terran regulations, we can't colonize Arz. It would be armed invasion. Invasion of a squid world? Farrell protested, baffled. Why should surface colonization conflict with an undersea culture, Gib? Why couldn't we share the planet? Because the octopods own the islands too and keep them policed, Gibson said patiently. They even own the pink fishes. It was one of the squid people making a dry land canvas of his preserve here to pick a couple of victims for this morning's show that carried you off last night. Behold a familiar pattern shaping up, Stryker said. He laughed suddenly, a great irrepressible bellow of sound. Ours is a squid's world, Arthur, don't you see? And like most civilized people, they're sportsmen. The flying lizards are the game they hunt, and they raise the pink fishes for... Farrell swore in astonishment. Then those poor devils are put out there deliberately, like worms on a hook, angling in reverse. No wonder I couldn't spot their motivation. Gibson got up and sealed the port, shutting out the soft morning breeze. Colonization being out of the question, we may as well move on before the octopods get curious enough about us to make trouble. Do you feel up to the acceleration, Arthur? Farrell and Stryker looked at each other, grinning. Farrell said, You don't think I want to stick here and be used for bait again, do you? He and Stryker were still grinning over it when Gibson, unamused, blasted the Marco 4 free of Arz. Unwelcome Tenant by Roger Dee. Narrated by William Skye. The first Earthman to hit deep space discovered what was so terribly wrong with the world he had left behind. Why couldn't he turn back? It happened just before he reached the 0 point, the no man's land in space where the attenuated gravity fields of two planets meet and cancel out. Maynard was dividing his attention equally between the transparent bubble that housed the mind's pendulum and the two ports, forward and aft, that broke the steel panelling of the control cubicle. He listened critically to the measured clicking of the Geiger counters and the quiet sibilance of the air purifiers, and in spite of his weightlessness and his total loss of equilibrium, he was quite calm. But deep inside him, under his trained calmness, Maynard felt a steadily growing triumph, a swelling exultation that was a thing quite apart from scientific pride. The feeling that he was a pioneer, an advanced guard for a conquering people, elated him and multiplied the eagerness in him when he turned his eyes to the forward port where Mars hung, full and ruddy, a spotted enigmatic disk of promise. Earth hung in the after port behind and below him, a soft emerald crescent in its first thin quarter. A warm green sickle that was home, a hustling, verdant young world impatient to push its way across black empty space and satisfy its lusty curiosity about its cosmic neighbours. He was at the end of his second day out, and he had covered roughly half of the distance he must travel. The atomic jets had cut off long ago at escape velocity, and would not come on again until they were needed to slow his approach. The midpoint lay just ahead. In a matter of minutes now he would leave Earth's waning field and fall free into the grasp of the red planet. He was watching the cobalt ball of the mind's pendulum quiver on its thin quartz thread with the first fluttering release of Earth's gravity when the fear came. Terror struck him suddenly, galvanically, blanking out all reason and all sensation. The control cubicle whirled giddily before his eyes, and the abysmal panic that gripped his mind was a monstrous thing boiling up out of unguessed subconscious depths. It froze him, breathing like a man paralyzed under an overwhelming electric shock. It was not fear of death. It was not even his own fear. It was the blind panic of something inside him whose existence he had never remotely suspected, something that shrieked soundlessly in senseless maniac terror and fought to tear itself free of him. He was torn by the struggle for an interminable instant, and then it was over. He felt it writhe loose from the encumbrance of his mind like a madman writhing out of a straitjacket, and then it was falling back toward earth, away from him. He could sense it plainly once it was outside him, a malevolent, intangible thing that fell back swiftly toward the emerald crescent of earth. He sat for a moment dazed while breath came back into his lungs and the steel-panelled cubicle grew steady again before his starting eyes. And when it had gone in the distance and he could no longer feel the frenzy of its terror, he felt the swift, unbounded freedom that a spirited horse feels when it has, unexpectedly, lost its rider. He was still Robert Maynard, but with a difference. He was free. The feeling of utter freedom staggered him. For the first time in his life, he possessed himself entirely, without doubt or reservation, a complete and serene entity. He could feel his consciousness still expanding, reaching into every hidden corner of his mind and taking control of functions he had not dreamed of before. An analogy occurred to him in perfect exactness of detail. He was like a man waking from a vague world of sleep to find that what he had thought a single small room was in reality a spacious house. There were other rooms than the cramped chamber he had lived in all his life, rooms that had been tenanted a moment before by something else, but which lay open and ready for his own use now that their tenant was gone. A moment before, his ego had occupied a mere 1/12 of his brain. With its departure, the whole of his mind was his. As suddenly as that, he knew what had happened to him and why, and his incredibly multiplied intelligence arranged the details of it precisely for his consideration. He had been host to a parasitic intelligence, without knowing it, all his life. He had moved at its dictates, following his own will only when it slept or tired or was distracted, never succeeding fully in any endeavour of his own because it was in control and must be obeyed. He knew, when he had explored the vacated premises of his newly freed mind, that it was only one of many, that all Earthmen had tenants like it, intangible parasitic entities subsisting upon and controlling the human life force. He thought, no wonder we have wars on Earth. We have no common ground for agreement because we are under their compulsion. They know our inherent abilities and keep us at each other's throat lest we learn of them and destroy them. Everything that man has accomplished has been done in spite of them. He looked with new eyes at the instrument panel under the forward port and was astonished at the crudity of the engines it controlled. He was primarily an astrophysicist, and his understanding of atomic propulsion had been negligible. Now its every function was clear to him at a glance. Experimentally, he drew a graph of the arc he described through space, and knew to a minute how long it would be before the braking jet slowed his speed for landing. He raised his eyes to the forward port where the ruddy disk of Mars hung framed against the black velvet backdrop of space, like a red jewel burning dully among a random display of lesser brilliance, beckoning him on with the future's illimitable promise. He sat quite still for a time on the padded control couch, thinking intently, testing the new powers of his mind as he might have flexed a newly discovered limb. His first conclusion was inescapable. His tenant had left him because it could not exist outside Earth's gravity. It had been forced to quit him or perish, and its departure had made him the first really free man. They were not invincible. They were not even particularly intelligent in spite of their gift of parasitic control, or his own tenant would have known its danger. The fact that they were gravity-bound entities gave him the first vulnerable chink in their armour, an Achilles heel that offered eventual salvation for men. There would be other ways to be rid of them, and it was his responsibility, as the first free man, to see that others of his kind were freed as he had been. He pictured the harmonious integration of an Earth peopled by free men, and saw clearly the heights men might reach unhampered by their tenants. His own possibilities, when he had summed them up, awed him in their extent. There were no limits to what he could do, no bounds to the knowledge he could accumulate and use. This is what being a man is really like. I can liberate a world. Like Moses, I can set my people free. The thought set his face shining, suffused him with a glow of anticipated triumph. It was all so simple now that he was free. In a few hours he would land on Mars, and in a matter of minutes he could set up a beam transmitter to report back to the scientific foundation that had sent him out. He could not tell his fellows the truth because they were still captive, and their tenants must not be warned, but he could invent a plausible story of easily acquired wealth on Mars that would bring other and larger commercial expeditions swarming after him. With the help of other freed men, he could found a new civilization on the Red Planet, develop means to carry the fight back to Earth, and exterminate the tenants utterly. It would take time, but in the end, men would be free. The mind centrifuge spun slowly, and with the swing of its cobalt ball, Maynard felt the shift from terrestrial to Martian gravity. He felt the first tiny tug of weight, and the slow returning of equilibrium as his body oriented itself to the growing pull of the new attraction. With the return of equilibrium, he suddenly realized that he was upside down and turned to the control board for correction. The cubicle righted itself, rotating gently until the ruddy, expanding disk of Mars hung below and ahead of the forward port. The mind's pendulum ceased to oscillate, the little cobalt ball hanging stiffly at the end of its taut quartz filament. He was well into the Martian attraction field by now. He made a quick calculation, which once would have taken painstaking hours, and knew that he would release the first braking blast from his forward jets in precisely 10 hours. The little ship would nose into a slowly tightening spiral, avoiding the odd-planed orbits of the two tiny moons, and within minutes of establishing his declaration track, he would be ready to land. He watched eagerly as the red disk of Mars swelled to a mottled globe, blurred already at the edges by atmospheric refraction. Down there on the dead ground of that ancient world, he would set up his equipment and flash back his triumphant message to Earth, a fabulous exultant lie that would bring other men like him swarming to the Red Planet. Free men! Supermen, really, in a new free world. Nothing impossible then. Later, he shut off the braking blast of the forward jets and felt the soft rubber foam padding of the couch rise gently under him as deceleration ceased. He was well into his landing spiral, eating up the paltry thousands of miles that lay between him and the shining future. He lay back on the couch, smiling, his mind busy with the message he would beam back to Earth, planning already the campaign he would carry out. Years must pass before men were freed completely of their tenants, perhaps decades, but time did not matter. It was essentially a simple task, because he and those to come after him would be free of their compulsion, serene, unhampered supermen to whom time was nothing. In the end, they could not fail. Something impinged sharply upon his new perception, a chill, groping tentacle of questioning intelligence. The smile froze on his face. He sat up stiffly, numbed with the unforeseen horror of what was happening to him. The groping ceased, and the hungry intelligence from outside poured into his mind like smoke into an empty room, smothering his feeble attempt at resistance. He rose and went to the forward port, staring dully down at the uprushing sandy wastes, and trying to recall what glorious thing it was that he had been thinking. Or had it been only a dream? Somewhere in the farthest recess of his blunted consciousness, a thought formed and floated like a bubble up into his awareness, but like a bubble it burst, and its meaning was lost on him. There were tenants on Earth, it said. Why not on Mars, too? If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button to support the channel. Thanks. Clean Break by Roger Dee. Narrated by William Skye. A veteran veterinarian might have vamoosed, but what's had to help any sick animal? Nothing more exciting ever happened to Oliver Watts than being rejected by his draft board for a punctured eardrum until, deferring as usual to the superior judgment of his Aunt Katisha and of Glenna, his elder and militantly spinster sister, he put away his lifelong dream and took up, at the age of 25, the practice of veterinary medicine. The relinquished dream was Oliver's ambition, cherished since childhood, to become someday a hunter and trainer of jungle animals. It had been discouraged firmly and at length by his Aunt Katisha, who maintained that the skin of the last male Watts was not to be risked in a pursuit so perilous, and his Aunt Katisha won. He would do far better, Oliver realized finally, to resign himself to the quiet suburban life of Lansdale, Florida, and to perpetuate the Watts line by marrying some worthy and practical local girl. The quiet life, it developed, was that of a DVM, the worthy and practical girl, Miss Aurella Sims of Tampa, to whom he was now engaged. To put it plainly, Oliver was, until the moment of his great opportunity, a good-humoured stooge with a cowlick and a sense of responsibility, whose invariable cue was family obligation and whose crowning virtue was docility. He was manoeuvred into becoming a DVM, though to tell the truth the profession suited him well enough, being the nearest possible approach to realizing his ambition, solely because the veterinary college in Tampa was near enough to Lansdale for commuting, and because his later practice could be carried on under the guiding aegis of his personal matriarchy. The virtuous and vapid Aurella Sims became his fiancée by the same tactics and for the same reasons. Oliver had considered rebellion, of course, but common sense discouraged the idea. He had no intimates outside his family, nor any experience with the world beyond Lansdale and Tampa, and his fledgling self-confidence invariably bogged down in a welter of introspective apprehensions when he thought of running away. Where would he go, and to whom could he turn in emergency? Such was the character and condition of Oliver Watts when his newly undertaken practice of veterinary medicine threw him into the company of Mr. Thomas Fernay, and of a girl whose name, as nearly as it can be rendered into English, was Pearl High C Trill and A above. Their advent brought Oliver face to face for the first time in his sedentary life with high adventure, with adventure so high, as a matter of fact, that it took him literally and bodily out of his humdrum world. The initial step was taken when Mr. Fernay, known to Lansdale as a wealthy and eccentric old recluse who had recently leased a walled property on Federal Route 27 that had once been the winter retreat of a Prohibition-era gangster, was driven by emergency to call upon Oliver for professional service. Mr. Fernay usually kept very much to himself behind his iron-grilled gates and his miles of stuccoed wall, but it happened that in pursuit of his business, whose true nature would have confounded Lansdale to its insular core, he had just bought up the entire menagerie of an expiring circus builder's Scuderian brothers, and it was the sudden illness of one of his newly acquired animals that forced him to breach his isolation. Mr. Fernay called at the Watts place in his town car, driven by a small, dark and taciturn chauffeur named Bivins. He found Oliver at work in his neatly ordered clinic at the rear of the big house, busily spooning cod liver oil into a trussed and thoroughly outraged chow named Champ. "I have a sick animal," Mr. Fernay stated tersely. He was a slight man with a moderately long and wrinkled face, a Panama hat 2 sizes too large, and a voice that had, in spite of its excellent diction, a jarring timbre and definitely foreign flavour. Oliver blinked, surprised and a little dismayed that fate should have sent him so early in his career, a known and patently captious millionaire. Bivins, waiting in visored and putteed impassivity to reopen the door for his master, was silently impressive. The town car, parked on the crushed shell driveway outside, glittered splendidly in the late afternoon sunshine. "I'll be happy to call later in the day," Oliver said. He removed the padded block that had held Champ's jaws apart, and narrowly missed losing a finger as the infuriated chow snapped at his hand. "My aunt and sister are bringing my fiancé down from Tampa for dinner this evening, and I can't leave the clinic until they get here. Someone might call for his pet." Mr. Fernay protested his extremity of need. "The animal suffers periodic convulsions," he said. "It may be dangerously ill." Oliver unstrapped Champ from his detention frame and dodged with practiced skill when the chow tried to bite him on the thigh. He had taken it for granted, having heard none of the gossip concerning Mr. Fernay's recent purchase of the Scuderian Brothers Menagerie, that the sick animal in question was a dog or cat or perhaps a saddle horse, and the bald description of its symptoms startled him more than Champ's predictable bid for revenge. "Convulsions? What sort of animal is it, Mr. Fernay?" "A polar bear," said Mr. Fernay. "Polar bear?" echoed Oliver, and in his shock of surprise he dropped a detaining strap and let Champ loose. The dog sprang across the room, without a breath of warning, as chows will, and bit Bivens on the leg just above his puttee. The chauffeur screamed in a high and peculiarly raucous voice and jerked away, jabbering in a vowel-less and totally unfamiliar foreign tongue. Mr. Fernay said something sharply in the same grating language. Bivens whipped out a handkerchief, pressed it over the tear in his whipcords, and went quickly out to the car. Oliver collared the snarling Champ and returned him to his cage, where the dog pressed bristling against the bars and stared at Mr. Fernay hungrily with wicked, muddy eyes. Mr. Fernay's shocked voice said, behind Oliver, "What a ghastly world where even the pets—" He broke off sharply as Oliver turned from the cage. "I'm truly sorry, Mr. Fernay," Oliver apologised. "If there's anything I can do, a dressing for Bivens's leg." Mr. Fernay gathered himself with an effort. "It is nothing, a scratch that will heal quickly. But my bear, you will come to see him at once?" At another time, the thought of absenting himself without due notice to his Aunt Katisha and Glenna would have prompted Oliver to refuse, but the present moment called more for diplomacy than for convention. Better to suffer matriarchal displeasure, he thought, than to risk a damage suit by a millionaire. "I'll come at once," Oliver said. "I owe you that, I think, after the fright Champ gave you." And belatedly, the realization that he might handle a bear, a great live lumbering bear, surged up inside him to titillate his old boyhood yearning. Perhaps it was as well that his aunt and sister were away. This chance to exercise his natural skill at dealing with animals was too precious to decline. "Of course, I won't guarantee a cure," Oliver said, qualifying his promise, "because I've never diagnosed such a case. But I think I can help your bear." Oddly enough, he was almost sure that he could. Oliver, in his younger days, had read a great deal on the care and treatment of circus animals, and the symptoms in this instance had a familiar sound. Mr. Fernay's bear, he thought, in all probability, had worms. The Fernay town car purred away, leaving Oliver to marvel at his own daring while he collected the instruments and medicines he might need. In leaving the clinic, he noted that Mr. Fernay's chauffeur had dropped his handkerchief at the doorway in his hurry to be gone, but Oliver by this time was in too great a hurry to stop and retrieve it. His Aunt Katisha might spoil the whole adventure on the instant with a telephone call from Tampa. Bivens could wait. The drive, after a day spent in the antiseptic confines of his clinic, was like a holiday jaunt. The late June sun was hot and bright, the rows of suburban houses trim and clean as scrubbed children sunning themselves among colour-splashed crotons and hibiscus and flaming poincianas. Oliver whistled gaily as he turned his little white-panelled coal truck off the highway and drove between twin ranks of shedding cabbage palms toward the iron gates of the Fernay estate. A uniformed gateman who might have been a twin to Bivens admitted him, pointing out a rambling white building that lay behind the stuccoed mansion, and shut the gate. Oliver parked his truck before the menagerie building. It had been a stable in the heyday of the Prohibition-era gangster when it had held horses or cases of contraband as occasion demanded, and found Bivens waiting for him. Bivens, looking upset and sullen in immaculate new whipcords, opened the sliding doors without a word. The vast inside of the remodelled stable was adequately lighted by roof windows and fluorescent bulbs, but seemed dark for the moment after the glare of sun outside. There was a smell, familiar to every circus-goer, of damp straw and animal dung, and a restless background stir of purring and growling and pacing. Oliver gaped when his eyes dilated enough to show him the real extent of Mr. Fernay's menagerie holdings. At the north end of the building, two towering Indian elephants swayed on picket, munching hay and shuffling monotonously on padded, ponderous feet. A roped-off enclosure held half a dozen giraffes which nibbled in aristocratic deprecation at feed bins bracketed high on the walls, and beyond them 3 disdainful camels lay on untidily folded legs, sneering glassily at the world and at each other. The east and west sides of the building were lined with rank after rank of cages holding a staggering miscellany of predators, great maned lions with their sleek green-eyed mistresses, restless tigers undulating their stripes back and forth and grinning in sly, tusky boredom, chattering monkeys and chimpanzees, leopards and cheetahs, and a pair of surly black jaguars whose claw-scored hides indicated either a recent difference of opinion or a burst of conjugal affection. The south end of the vast room had been recently partitioned off, with a single heavy door breaking the new wall at its centre. On either side of this door the bears held sway, shaggy grizzlies, black bears, cinnamon and brown, spectacle Andeans and sleek white polars padding silently on tufted feet. The sick bear sulked in a cage to himself, humped in an oddly dog-like pose with his great head hanging disconsolately. Oliver sized up the situation, casting back to past reading for the proper procedure. "I'll need a squeeze cage and a couple of cage boys to help immobilize the brute," he said. "Will you?" He was startled in turning to find that Bivens had not accompanied him into the building. He was not alone, however. The door at the centre of the partitioning wall had opened while he spoke, and a slender blonde girl in the briefest of white sunsuits was looking at him. Apparently she had not expected Oliver, for there was open interest in her clear green eyes. She said something in a clear and musical, but completely unintelligible, voice that ranged with a remarkably operatic effect through 2 full octaves. Oliver stared. "I'm here to doctor the sick bear," he said. "Oh, a native?" the girl said in English. Obviously she was trying to keep her voice within the tonal range of his own, but in spite of the effort it trilled distractingly up and down the scale in a fashion that left Oliver smitten with a sudden and unfamiliar weakness of the knees. "May I help?" she said. She might, Oliver replied. She could have had as readily, he might have added, a pint of his blood. Many times while they worked, finding a suitable squeeze cage and dragging it against the bear's larger cage so that the 2 doors coincided, Oliver found the prim and reproachful image of Miss Aurella Sims rising to remind him of his obligations. But for the first time in his life, an obligation was surprisingly easy to dismiss. His assistant's lively conversation, which was largely uninformative though fascinatingly musical, bemused him even to the point of shrugging off his Aunt Catitia's certain disapproval. The young lady, it seemed, came from a foreign country whose name was utterly unpronounceable. Oliver gathered that she had not been long with Mr. Fernay, who was of another nationality, and that she was homesick for her native land, for its saffron sun on turquoise hills and umber sea, which could only be poetic exaggeration or simple unfamiliarity with colour terms of a newly learned language, and that she was, as a consequence, very lonely. She was, incredibly, a trainer of animals. "Not of such snarling fierce ones as yours," she said, with a little shiver for the polar bear watching them sullenly through the bars, "but of my own gentle beasts, who are friends." Her name was a startling combination of soprano sounds that might have been written as Pearl, High C, Trill and A above, but which Oliver was completely unable to manage. "Would you mind," he asked, greatly daring, "if I called you Pearl instead?" She would not, but apparently Mr. Fernay would. The millionaire, who had entered the menagerie unheard, spoke sternly to the girl in his own raucous tongue, and pointed a peremptory finger toward the door through which she had come. The girl murmured, "Ai duxain samai," in a disappointed tone, gave Oliver a smile that would have stunned a harem guard, and disappeared again into her own territory. Oliver, being neither Chesterfield nor eunuch, was left with the giddy sensation of a man struggling to regain his balance after a sudden earth tembler. His client reoriented him brusquely. "Treat my bear," Mr. Fernay said. "I've been waiting for help," Oliver said defensively. "If you'll send around your menagerie manager and a cage boy or two." "I have none," Mr. Fernay said shortly. "There are only the 4 of us here, and not one will approach within touching distance of a brute so vicious." Oliver stared at him in astonishment. 4 of them meant only Bivins, the gateman, the lovely blonde creature who called herself Pearl High C Trill and A above, and Mr. Fernay himself. "But 4 inexperienced people can't possibly look after a menagerie of this size," Oliver protested. "Circus animals aren't house pets, Mr. Fernay. They're restless and temperamental, and they need expert care. They bite and claw each other." "There will be more of us later," Mr. Fernay said morosely, "but I doubt that numbers will help. We had not anticipated a ferocity so appalling, and I fear that my error may have proved the ruin of an expensive project. The native beasts were never so fierce on other—" He broke off. "I am sorry. You will have to manage as best you can alone." And he left the menagerie without looking back. To deal tersely with subsequent detail, Oliver did manage alone, after a fashion and up to a point. It was a simple matter once he found a 4-foot length of conveniently loose board to prod the unhappy bear from his larger prison to the smaller. The process of immobilizing the brute by winching the squeeze cage tight was elementary. But in his casting back, Oliver had overlooked 2 vitally important precautions. He'd forgotten to secure the gear fastenings, and he'd neglected to rope the smaller cage to the larger. The bear, startled by the prick of the needle when Oliver gave him a sizable injection of Nembutal, reacted with a frantic struggling that reversed the action of the unsecured winch and forced the 2 cages apart. The door burst open, sprung by the sudden pressure. The bear stood free. A considerable amount of legitimate excitement could be injected into such a moment by reporting that the bear, at last in a position to revenge itself for past indignities, leaped upon its tormentor with a blood-freezing roar, and that Oliver, a fragile pygmy before that near ton of slavering fury, escaped only by a hair or was annihilated on the spot. Neither circumstance developed, however, for the reason that the bear was already feeling the effects of the anaesthetic given it, and wanted nothing so much as a cool, dark place where it might collapse in privacy. And Oliver, caught completely off guard, was too stunned by the suddenness of catastrophe to realize his own possible danger. What did happen was that Pearl High C Trill and A above chose that particular moment to open her door again and look out. Her fortuitous timing altered the situation on the instant. The bear, bent only on escape and seeing comparative gloom beyond the door, charged not at Oliver, but through the opening. And Oliver, still too confused to think past the necessity of retrieving his error, ran after it, brandishing his length of board and shouting wildly. The smaller area beyond the partition was dimly lighted, but to judge by its straw-covered floor and faint animal smell, was evidently a special division of Mr. Fernay's menagerie. The light was too dim and the emergency too great to permit Oliver more than a brief and incredulous glimpse of the improbable beast placidly munching hay in a corner. His whole attention was centred first on the fleeing bear, and then upon the prostrate form of Pearl High C Trill and A above, who had been violently bowled over by the bear's rush. "Pearl!" yelled Oliver, petrified with horror. The bear stood swaying upright over her, thrashing its tufted forepaws for balance, and showing yellow tusks in a grimace that stemmed from drugged weakness, but which passed quite creditably for a snarl of demoniac fury. Obviously something had to be done. Oliver, galvanized by the realization, came to the rescue with a promptness that amounted to reflex action. "Down, boy!" he said, and dealt the bear a sharp blow across the muzzle with his board. The bear dealt Oliver a roundhouse clout in return that stretched him half-conscious beside Pearl High C Trill and A above. Then, at precisely that moment of greatest dramatic impact, it shook its head dizzily and passed out cold. The girl scrambled up and knelt beside Oliver to listen to his heartbeat, found that he was alive, and raised her voice in an urgent arpeggio that held, in spite of its operatic timbre, a distinct note of command. In answer to her call, the great beast in the corner, built something on the order of a hippopotamus but with unorthodox variations in that it boasted 6 legs to either side and was covered with close curling bright blue wool, trotted out of the shadows and scooped up the unconscious bear in its 4 powerful anterior arms. A word from Pearl High C Trill and A above sent it into the main menagerie quarters, where it stuffed the limp bear into its old cage and trotted back to its mistress with a look of adoring deference on its round face. The girl gave the creature a random trill of commendation, and displaying surprising strength for one so slight, herself dragged the reviving Oliver back to the scene of his unfinished diagnosis. The order given her earlier by Mr. Fernay was not forgotten, however, for she did not linger. "Not handsome, no," she murmured, locking the partition door behind her this time. "But oh, personal deity of unmarried maidens, such headlong bravery!" Oliver roused 10 minutes later to find himself alone with a memory of nightmare and a sleeping bear that offered no resistance whatever when he funneled a quantity of tetrachloroethylene down its throat. He was still alone an hour later, and still trying dizzily to separate fact from fancy, having tried the partition door and found it locked, when the bear returned to semi-consciousness and submitted groggily to a follow-up dosage of purgative. Oliver would have liked to stay long enough to learn the results of his diagnosis, and to see Pearl High C Trill and A above if she should reappear, but a glance at his watch electrified him with the realization that he had been away from his clinic for more than 2 hours, and that his Aunt Katisha and Glenna might by now have the state police beating the Palmetto Flats for his body. Accordingly, he left the Fernay estate in a great hurry, pausing at the gate only long enough to leave word for Mr. Fernay that he would ring later in the evening to check his patient's progress. It was not until he had returned home and found his Aunt Katisha still out that his overworked nerves, punished outrageously by shock, violence, and confusion, composed themselves enough to permit him a reasonable guess as to what actually had happened, and by that time his conclusions had taken a turn so fantastically improbable that he was lost again in a hopeless muddle of surmise. He poured himself a glass of milk in the kitchen. He preferred coffee, but his Aunt Katisha frowned on the habit, and took his grisly suspicions down to the clinic, where he felt more at ease than in the antimacassar austerity of the house. There he mulled them over again, and time was able to weave into the pattern the disjointed impressions carried over from his period of semi-consciousness and dismissed until now as nightmare figments from the delirium of shock. Their alignment with other evidence increased his conviction. Mr. Fernay and Menage, Oliver concluded with a cold thrill of horror, were not human beings at all, but monsters. The pattern became even more disturbing when he considered various stories of local saucer sightings and fireballs which linked themselves with chilling Germanity to the events of the day. First, there had been Champ's instant distrust of Mr. Fernay and Bivens, and his attempt to rout them for the aliens they were. There had been Bivens' anomalous scream when bitten, a raucous sound certainly not human, and Mr. Fernay's grittily inconsonant order, spoken in no identifiable earthly tongue. The isolation of the Fernay estate took on a sinister and significant logic, as did its understaffed condition. There was the evident but baffling reluctance of Fernay and his myrmidons, with the notable exception of the golden-voiced Pearl, to approach even safely caged beasts, and the greater mystery of why a man so terrified of wild animals should have bought a menagerie in the first place. Considering the part played by Pearl High C Trill and A above in a scheme of things so fantastic left Oliver more disturbed than ever, but for a different reason. That she was unarguably as alien as the others made her equally mysterious, but connoted no share in whatever devious plot occupied the Fernay faction. A re-examination of Mr. Fernay's harshly dictatorial attitude toward her, coupled with Oliver's own uncertain memory of the moment when the girl had come to his rescue, convinced him that she was not ipso facto a member of the extraterrestrial cabal, but was its prisoner instead. Visualizing the probable fate of a beautiful girl held captive by aliens, and forced by them to train outlandish, half-remembered brutes like the one behind the partition, rather strained Oliver's talent for surmise, but at the same time moved him to the uneasy conviction that it was his duty to rescue her in turn. The thought that he might already be too late appalled him. The slender blonde beauty of Pearl High C Trill and A above was distractingly fresh in his mind, the eager arpeggiation of her voice an indelible memory. Recalling the smile she had given him in parting stirred an internal warmth unguessed at before, an emotional ignition certainly never kindled by his fiancée or family. Orella Sims, Glenna, his Aunt Katisha! Thought of his obligations brought him back to reality with a jar. The appalling gulf between fact and fancy made clear to him with sudden and shocking clarity the non-entity's role that had been played, and must be played, all his life by Oliver Watts. He was the perennial romantic introvert, dreaming impossible dreams compounded of escape reading and frustration, grasping timorously at any thread of adventure that might lead him to forget for the moment the drab monotone of his existence. His mouth twisted wryly. There was, of course, no fantastic alien plot incubating on the Ferney estate, no sun-suited damsel in distress awaiting rescue at his inept hands. He'd imagined the romantic aspects of the episode, the unearthly tongue, the improbable beast. No one required, or ever would require, anything of Oliver Watts except his Aunt Katisha and Glenna, who demanded obedience, and Orella Sims, who expected conformity. As if on cue, the Watts family car swung off the highway and rolled down the crushed shell driveway past the clinic. Oliver's Aunt Katisha got out, leaving Glenna and Orella Sims to wait, and strode into the clinic office. "I see you've managed to spoil another one," she said acidly, pausing long enough to retrieve the handkerchief Mr. Ferney's chauffeur had lost earlier. "Moreover, I called twice this afternoon and found you gone. Where?" Oliver, as usual, weathered the storm in silence. Somewhere near the end, he managed to squeeze in the information that he had treated a sick animal at the Ferney place. A saddle horse, he said, lying automatically as the lesser of two evils. His Aunt Katisha, her inquisitorial duty discharged, dropped the discoloured handkerchief pointedly on Oliver's desk and rejoined Glenna and Orella Sims. The car drove away. Oliver, left alone in the growing dusk of evening to his miserable introspection, found his wandering attention returning unaccountably to the crumpled handkerchief, and drew it closer for a better look. It was only a harmless square of linen, smudged with dust and spotted with blood from Bivens's chow-bitten leg, but with his closer look Oliver's world sprang up and exploded with a shattering bang in his startled face. The dust was quite ordinary, but Bivens' blood was not. It was green. He was never quite sure later just what happened next. He retained a vague memory of roaring away in his Aunt Katisha's car through a reckless showering of crushed shell. Sometimes he could recall the cool onrush of wind whipping his face and the frantic dodging of approaching headlamps on the highway. But in the main, his descent upon the Ferney estate was a blank. Only one fact stood out with freezing clarity, excluding any thought of his Aunt Katisha's certain wrath or of Orella's maidenly reproaches. Pearl High C Trill and A above was in deadly danger, and there was none but Oliver Watts to rescue her. There was a brief instant of lucidity as he approached the Ferney gate through the cabbage palms and was forced to choose a course of action. The attendant certainly would not admit him without orders from Mr. Ferney, who as certainly would not give them. The walls were much too high and sheer for climbing, and to make the need for haste even more critical, it was only too obvious that the Ferney gang was about to depart. A tremendous saucer-shaped ship had landed by the menagerie building, where it sat with circular peripheral ports aglow and lines of bold, enigmatic hieroglyphs fluorescing greenly on its smooth undersurface. Jointed metal figures scurried here and there, chivying the last of Mr. Ferney's herbivores up a ramp into the belly of the ship. The predators in cages drawn by other sleek robot stevedores followed in orderly procession. Oliver solved his problem of entry by driving headlong through the iron grill work. There was a raucous yelling from the gateman, a monstrous rending of metal and jangling of broken glass. Aunt Catitia's car slewed erratically down the Ferney Drive, turned over twice, and pitched Oliver out, stunned for the second time that day, into the greenish glow shed by the saucer's ship lights. He struggled back to awareness to find his head pillowed on something soft and wonderfully comfortable. A circle of startled faces, most of them dark facsimiles of the putteed Bivenses, stared uncertainly down at him. In the near foreground stood Mr. Ferney, wringing his hands and muttering grittily to himself in his own dissonant tongue. Mr. Ferney, seen now for the first time without his too large Panama, exhibited instead of hair a crest of downy blue feathers and pronged antennae that vibrated softly in the evening breeze. "Where is she?" Oliver demanded. He scrambled dizzily to his feet, and the circle of faces melted backward hastily. "What have you done with Pearl, you monsters?" Pearl High C Trill and A Above, on whose lap Oliver's head had been pillowed, stood up to move between Oliver and the patently apprehensive Mr. Ferney. She wore a light maroon cape over her sunsuit against the mild chill of evening, and could not possibly have looked less like a damsel in distress. She seemed, as a matter of fact, quite happy. "I hoped you would come to see me again before blast-off," she said. Her voice skipped, tinkling with pleasure from octave to octave. "But so suddenly, so dashing, so impetuous." "You're going away willingly?" Oliver said dumbly. "Then they're not forcing... You're not a prisoner after all?" Her laugh was an arpeggiando blending of surprise and amusement. "A prisoner of these Sami? No, I am a performer in their company, hired by Mr. Ferney to train and exhibit animals native to my own world." "But I heard Ferney threaten you in the menagerie building this afternoon. His tone..." "The Sami tongue sounds dreadful because it is all consonants and not based on pitch and nuance as mine is," she said. "But the Sami themselves are only tradesmen and are very gentle. Mr. Ferney, only feared that I might say too much to you then, when it was important that the natives should not suspect our identity." "It is true," Mr. Ferney nodded, sounding relieved. "We must avoid notice on such worlds as yours, which are too backward to appreciate the marvels of our show. We stop here only to scout for new and novel exhibits."
"Show?" Oliver echoed. "You mean all this is...
"What else?" asked Mr. Ferney. He pointed with his antennae to the fluorescent hieroglyphs on the undersurface of the saucer ship. "See, in our lingua galactica, it reads, Scruff Brothers, Interstellar Circus, the galaxy's greatest. It is the best on the circuit." He indicated the circle of identical Bivenses. "These are the Scruff Brothers, our owners. I, sir, am business manager."
"But not always a good one," one of the brothers said pointedly. "This time he has bought an entire menagerie of such fierceness that our trainers cannot exhibit it. It will have to be sold to some frontier planet zoo, and our loss will be staggering." It was left for Pearl High C Trill and A Above to deal with the problem, which she did with universal feminine practicality. "Oliver made your bear well," she pointed out, "and he is afraid of nothing. Nothing. Could he not train his own fierce beasts as well as I train my gentle ones?"
Oliver said, "Huh?" The Scruff brothers, of course, implored Oliver on the spot to join them at any salary. Pearl High C Trill and A Above said demurely, in 3 octaves and for all the world to hear, "And I'm lonely, Oliver." Oliver never had a chance. Life in Lansdale goes quietly on, the ripples made by Oliver's departure long since smoothed away by the years. Miss Aurella Sims has married the Methodist minister who was to have married her to Oliver. Aunt Catitia and Glenna have resigned themselves to Oliver's escape and have taken over the job of assisting Aurella to superintend her husband's career, an occupation eminently satisfactory to all, because the placid cleric never dreams troublesome dreams of adventure, as Oliver did, to try their matriarchal patience. But life is never dull for Mr. and Mrs. Oliver Watts, whose breathtaking performances currently electrify the thrill-hungry cultures of 1,000 worlds. They have travelled from Sirius to Sagittarius, and at this writing have 2 children, a golden-haired daughter of 4 named Pearl High C Trill and A Sharp above, and a tow-headed boy of 2 who has a cowlick like his father's and whose name is Butch. They are very happy, and there has been no talk between them, though they are wealthy enough in galactic credits by now to have bought half a planet for a home, of settling down to the quiet life. They are quite satisfied to leave such consequential decisions to those who like change for the sake of change, or who, unlike Oliver, never know when they are well off. 1 clean break to a lifetime, Oliver maintains, is enough. Remember to like the video to help the channel grow. Thanks. The little guy comes into the bar just as the first Mars cast is about to start. He scoffs at scientific facts and keeps mumbling about The Frogs of Mars by Roger Dee. Narrated by William Skye. There was nothing special about the little man who came into Larry's place, unless it might have been his air of vague familiarity and the mixed expression on his face. He looked disgusted and defensive, and at the same time a little resentful, with a dash of something else thrown in which none of us recognized until later. I'd have mistaken him for another reporter from the Advertiser across the street, if the 5 newsmen already at the bar hadn't given each other a blank look that meant only one thing. None of them knew him. Neither did Larry, who was trying to bring in the first broadcast from Mars on the television set bracketed to the wall over his whiskey stock, and who wasn't pleased at having his little after-hours party crashed. "The bar's closed," Larry said. His tone didn't invite argument. "City ordinance. No customers after 1 a.m. The little man looked at the clock, which said 3:15, and then at the front windows, which were shuttered tight. Then he looked at the 6 of us sitting at the bar with our drinks. "I'll have bourbon and water," he said. He sat down at the end of the bar on the stool next to mine and looked at his reflection in the mirror without approval. Larry got the look that bartenders get with troublesome customers. "The bar's closed," he said again. "It's a city—" "Water on the side," the little man said. "Don't mix it." Abe Marker, who does sports for the Advertiser, got up and checked the front door lock. The thumb catch hadn't been thrown, so Abe put it on and came back to the bar. "Nobody else will wander in," he said. "Make with the TV, Larry. You're holding up the show." Larry looked stubborn. "It's after 1 a.m., he said, "and that door was supposed to be locked. There's a city ordinance." "You're breaking it already," the little man said, looking at us. He didn't seem angry, just weary and disgusted. "Not that I give a damn. All I want is a bourbon and water." "Better give it to him, Larry," Willard Saxton said from down the bar. Willard is the Advertiser's science editor and is an authority on the planets, especially Mars. "He'll probably turn you in if you throw him out." Larry muttered and looked mulish, but he rang up the little man's money and gave him a bourbon and water. The little guy drank it and looked at himself in the bar mirror with an expression that was just short of being a sneer. Larry grunted and went back to fiddling with the television set. Abe Marker came over and sat down on the stool to my left. "They're doing this all over town tonight," he said, explaining to the little man across me. "The bars have to observe curfew as usual, but most of them are letting a few regular customers stay late to see the Mars cast. Everybody is anxious to know what Colonel Sanderson and his crew found up there, so they're going to be disappointed," the little man said. He sounded sour but positive.
Mars ain't what people think it is, not by a hell of a sight. It stinks."
We all looked up at that, and somebody snickered. "Have you been to Mars, sir?" The little man didn't seem to mind when we laughed.
"Maybe," he said, and shoved his shot glass forward. "Another bourbon, bartender."
The station announcer came on screen then and told us what we already knew, that contact with Colonel Sanderson's party was delayed because of transmission difficulties. The Sanderson expedition would leave Mars for Earth in 2 more days when the current opposition was completed, but in the meantime the program's sponsors appreciated the interest shown by their public and would relay the broadcast to us as soon as contact was established. A film cartoon featuring a lizard named Freddy came on next, and Larry turned down the sound so he could hear orders for refills. The little man drank his bourbon and water and sneered at his reflection in the mirror. None of us paid him any further attention, but talk started up again along the bar. Somebody at the other end asked how long it took a television signal to travel across all that space, and choked on his drink when Willard Saxton told him. "My God," he said when he stopped coughing. "You mean Mars is so far away it takes 3 minutes just to see it?" All of us laughed at that but Larry and the little man at the end of the bar. "What I'm wondering," somebody else said, "is how the Colonel and his boys feel after breathing nothing but canned air for a year."
"Maybe the air up there is better than our scientists think," Abe Marker said. He winked at us and looked at the little man on my right. "How about it, friend? Is the air good on Mars?" "Breathable, but not good," the little guy said. "It smells like dead fish."
Silence fell along the bar while we waited for a straight man to raise his head. Willard Saxton took the bait. "And why should it smell so, may I ask?"
"Because Mars is lousy with fish," the little man said, "and because when the fish die, they stink."
Larry did a brisk business for a few minutes while we sized the little guy up again. He definitely wasn't drunk, but the task of deciding whether he was being deadpan comic or just nasty was a sort of challenge that called for thought. "But you'd need extensive oceans to support so many fish," Willard Saxon argued, still taking it seriously. "And if Mars had oceans, we'd have seen them long ago. They reflect light."
"Mars is too level for oceans," the little man said. "The water spreads out thin to make one big marsh, and you can't see it because the weeds that grow up from the bottom camouflage it."
Somebody down the bar said, "This gets curiouser and curiouser," and everybody laughed again but Willard and Larry and the little comic. Somebody else asked if he was a professional and what show he was on, but he didn't answer. He just pushed his shot glass forward instead.
"Another bourbon," he said.
The announcer came on screen again when the lizard cartoon went off and said that the Mars party's signal was beginning to come through and that as soon as it cleared up they would put it on the cable. Then he told us about a new kind of pretzel prepared with a special salt guaranteed to not give us hardening of the arteries, and after that we had another film cartoon. This one was about 2 crows at a circus, but nobody could follow it because Larry turned down the sound again. Between his 3rd and 4th stingers, Willard Saxton, who had a reputation to uphold being science editor of the Advertiser, had made up his mind by now to put the little man in his place. It burned him brown to see this character drinking bourbon and sneering at himself in the mirror and not caring a damn what we thought, and it put Willard under a sort of obligation to show him up. "Reliable tests have conclusively proved," Willard said, "that the atmosphere of Mars contains only minute traces of water vapor, and that its oxygen content is less than 1/100th the density necessary to sustain human life. Spectroanalysis findings—"
"A spectroanalysis of Earth from Mars," the little man said, "shows nothing beyond our heaviside layer and proves that we can't live here because nothing can breathe pure ozone."
He finished his bourbon and made chains of wet rings on the bar top with his glass. The mixed look on his face was so strong that for a moment I almost thought of the name for it. Willard stalled for time by ordering another stinger, a double this time, and Abe Marker took over. "How about those pictures of Martian dust storms the boys at Palomar make?" Abe asked. "You can't have dust storms on a marshy planet, can you?" "Those aren't dust storms," the little man said. "They're clouds of gnats." "Gnats?" we all said at once, and somebody down the bar, quicker-witted than the rest of us, added, "Gnats to you too, Charlie." "A fact," the little man said, but not as if he cared. "They travel in swarms thousands of miles wide, and they bite like hell." We sat and watched the two voiceless crows flap through the television cartoon for a while. Nobody spoke until the film was over and the screen went blank, when the little man caught Larry's eye and held up one finger. "Bourbon," he said. We heard a confused muttering of voices in the background and waited expectantly for Colonel Sanderson to speak to us from Mars, but apparently the network people were still having trouble with their transmission beam. The screen stayed blank. "You left out the interesting part, Charlie," somebody called from down the bar. "The Martian natives. How about them?" "There aren't any, as you'd know them," the little man said. He seemed to grow thoughtful for a moment. "But they are intelligent. They do things you couldn't do." "Such as what?" somebody asked. The little man shrugged. "Teleport. They're good at it, too." Saxton let out a laugh. "That would make them more intelligent than us," he said. "What do these Martians look like?" The little man screwed up his face distastefully. "Frogs." The reporter who had asked about natives got choked on his drink and had to be pounded on the back. On my left, Abe Marker leaned against the bar to look past me at the little guy. "Frogs we got now," he said admiringly. "By the billions." "There are more frogs on Mars," the little man said, "than there are gnats and fish together, and they never stop croaking. You'd have to hear it to believe it." The television screen lit up suddenly, chopping off conversation, and we were watching the first Mars cast in history. Colonel Sanderson himself was talking. He looked the way Stanley must have looked when he found Livingstone, gaunt and bearded and jumpy, and his crew, lined up behind him before the ship's pickup camera, were in no better shape. The lot of them stared hungrily out at us as if they had just found a peephole into heaven and couldn't wait to see if there was a gate farther along the fence. "Established conceptions of Martian aerography are completely erroneous," the colonel was saying. "There are no drifting deserts of sand or howling typhoons of ferrous dust. We can show you actual conditions better by camera, I think, than they could be detailed in words." The view jumped to another camera aimed from an outside port, and we saw Mars. Colonel Sanderson's voice kept up a running commentary behind the scene, but we only half heard him. The ship rested in about 2 feet of water. Around it, the whole world curved up to the horizon in a shallow, concave sweep like the inside of a great rusty bowl, lined with knee-high reeds that grew as far as the eye could see out of a knee-deep marsh. A fist-sized sun hung low in the sky, its glare dulled to a muddy crimson by a shimmering cloud of gnats that whirled and danced to infinity. There was a sort of vast, featureless roaring in the background that sounded like Niagara at 200 yards, not deafening, but loud enough to force Colonel Sanderson to raise his voice. "The frog noise is worst," he was saying. "It drives us to the point of insanity at times. One member of our party has succumbed to it already, a machinist named Wilkins who disappeared 2 weeks ago. Apparently the poor fellow drowned himself in the marsh, since no trace of him has been found since." That was when I realized why the little man on the stool beside me looked so familiar, because I had seen his pictures in the papers along with the rest of Sanderson's crew 1,000 times during the past year. The mixed expression on his face made sense now, too. He wasn't only disgusted and defensive, he was guilty. "So that's how you knew what it was like," I said. "You couldn't stick it out with the others, so you jumped ship. You deserted." He gave me a hangdog look. "It's not deserting unless the country is at war," he said. "It's just going over the hill, AWOL." The television roar got louder, and when I looked up, the ship's cameraman was doing a close-up for our benefit. He panned the shot downward until we seemed to be standing 10 feet above the marsh, and at that distance I could see plainly what it was that caused the uproar. The water between the reddish-brown reeds was thick with huge frogs, all blinking and croaking like mad. I remember thinking then that you couldn't really blame a man for jumping ship in a hole like that. It was bad enough to be stuck 30-odd million miles from home, so far that light itself needed 3 minutes to... "Hey, wait up!" I said to the little guy who was sneering at himself in the mirror again. "If you went AWOL up there, then how the hell did you get back here?" I didn't find out. The guy was gone. He had been standing there so close I could have touched him, but now he was gone. I looked around quick. Nobody else seemed to have noticed. All eyes were on the TV screen. Then I saw it. On the floor. 2 wet marks right where the guy should have been, where he was. 2 wet marks that had a funny shape to them. Web-like. I felt my throat tighten at the thought. I shook my head. What was going through it was fantastic, impossible, and downright lunacy. There was an intelligent life form on Mars, beings that looked like frogs and could teleport. Could they also mimic human shape temporarily? Especially if they got hold of one for a model, say a missing crewman. "Hey, where are you going? Don't you want to see the Mars cast?" I was walking to the door. I looked back at the barkeep. "I've seen enough, Larry. I got things to do." He shrugged. "Yeah? What?" "Like hunting frogs," I told him as I shoved the door open. "I got a hunch we'll be doing a lot of that before very long." Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this compilation, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. That helps with the algorithm, as does leaving a comment about your favorite story or interesting things you noticed. And don't forget to look in the description for a link to my Substack, where you can get even more narrations. See you in the next one.